Hello and thank you for joining me here at Why the Book Wins. My name is Laura and today I'm here to talk about books that are just as good when you read them the second time around. And I realized another title for this could have been just like my favorite books, part one, because these are books that I loved the first time and I loved them so much that I read them a second time and then they were just as good the second time. And a lot of these books are ones that I would consider like some of my favorites and ones that I would definitely recommend. And that is one reason why I do like rereading books that I love, because if I'm recommending them, I want to make sure that they hold up and that they're as good as I remember them being. And so I want to read them a second time. And I have noticed there's books where the first time you read them, they're good, but then when you try to read it again, it just doesn't have that spark anymore. You're not as interested because you already know the whole story, right? And so I think a book that has you interested even when you know everything that's going to happen, that's a sign of like a great book. Also, I am out of town, so I'm filming outside. I know the quality isn't as good as usual, so I apologize, but I will be back home fairly soon and we will get back to my usual setting. So as I was making this list of books, I noticed that they all had either one, like just beautiful prose, beautiful writing, like very poetic, and or they had fantastic characters that I was just so drawn to and that felt so real, and or three, it had a plot that just gave you a lot to think about and a lot to chew on and a lot to dwell on, and that also makes for a good reread because there's just so much to think about. And so those are three things that these books have, either like one or some of those going on. So the first one I want to talk about is Big Little Lies by Liane Moriarty. Also, all of these books, I read them twice, like close together. So it's not like, oh, I read this book 12 years ago and then I read it again and I still liked it. Like, that's such a huge gap. Like, of course it would feel as good as the first time because it's been so long. So these are all ones that I read in close succession. Anyway, so I've read Big Little Lies twice and I loved it. And this is one where there are some like shocking reveals, and the first time around, like you can't stop reading because you want to figure out like what's going on and who did this and who did that and who died. And so it's definitely one that has you on the edge of your seat the first time around, whereas the second time, maybe I wasn't on the edge of my seat, but this still has just such great characters, and so I still loved reading about them. And there's also just certain things you can pick up on because there are a lot of details throughout this book. And so as you're reading it the second time, you can pick up on some of those details because you're not as focused on trying to figure out what happens because you already know. So then you can pay more attention to the subtleties of the book. And I was so attached to these characters. So I read this for the first time in 2017. And afterwards, I didn't feel like taking the time to read the show. And so I read up. Basically, I read someone's blog that does the same thing I do now. At the time, I didn't have Why the Book Wins. Anyway, someone blogged telling me what was changed from book to TV show. And they made a change to the character of Madeline, who Reese Witherspoon plays. And I remember when I read that, which I won't get into what the change was because it's a spoiler. But when I read the change they made to her character, I was so upset because I felt so connected to her as if she was like someone I knew. And I was like, she would not have done that. She is not that kind of person. How dare they say she does this? Like, I just felt so defensive of her. I felt so defensive of all of these women in this book, the three main characters. And yeah, I was just so attached to them. So in the second time around, I felt just as attached, just as invested. And Liane Moriarty, for the most part, is really great at creating these in-depth, well-rounded characters who have a lot of nuance to them. Apples Never Fall and 9 Perfect Strangers, I didn't like. I read 9 Perfect Strangers once and like I liked it. And I tried reading it a second time and I could not get through it because I already knew what would happen. And even though the characters are very layered, it was just too much and she went on too long. And because I already knew what happened, there wasn't that intrigue. And so I lost interest fairly quickly and I quit like a quarter of the way through my second time around. So anyway, but Big Little Lies, just as good the second time. If you haven't read it at all, you definitely should. And then next up is If Beale Street Could Talk, which is by James Baldwin. This is one where it is just such beautiful prose. James Baldwin is a poet and I love reading books written by poets because they are always just so eloquent and so beautiful, and it's just so wonderful. And then you have the characters of Tish and Fonnie and their romance, and just their relationship is just so incredible and touching, and as well as like their relationships with their family members, and the story itself is just so sad and poignant, and yeah, it's just a great story. And then you have these great characters who have a love that is just so pure and so strong and so incredible, and then you have just beautiful writing on top of that. And I read this one twice, like within a few months. I read it twice. Also, the audiobook is fantastic. One of the best audiobooks I've listened to. Bonnie Turpin narrated it, and now I always keep an eye out for Bonnie Turpin books on Audible. So yeah, highly recommend the audiobook. But if you read it too, it's just as, it's a great experience to just read it as well. And then Jane Eyre is another favorite of mine that I have read twice. And if you are familiar with my book collection, you know that I own multiple copies of Jane Eyre. So I've really enjoyed just seeking out multiple copies of that book, vintage copies, illustrated editions, just stuff like that. But anyway, I love the book Jane Eyre. Again, it's beautiful writing, great imagery, very vivid, very evocative. And I love the character of Jane as well. She is incredible. And there are just so many beautiful passages of dialogue, and this is another book that just has a lot to it, so there's a lot to think about and dwell on, both the first time around and the second time around. So yeah, this is another one I would highly recommend. And The Picture of Dorian Gray, I think I've only read this twice, maybe 3 times, but I think just twice. But again, Oscar Wilde was a poet, and so just incredible prose. And the story itself, I really love. There are some parts, like in the middle, where it kind of rambles on a bit at times. However, I still really enjoyed it both times. And again, this is another one. You have beautiful prose, you have really interesting characters, and then you have just a really interesting story as well, and one that gives you a lot to think about. And it is very famous, very well known, so a lot of people have already read it. Yeah, and this is one I definitely want to read a 3rd time. So maybe next year I will read it yet again, because I'm already craving a reread. And then very different from, like Jane Eyre and Beale Street and Dorian Gray, the next one on my list is Bullet Train by Kotaro Isaka. This one, my Bookverse movie, just came out recently, and I have been talking about this book a lot the last few weeks ever since I finished it, because it was incredible. And yes, I finished this for the first time a few weeks ago, and yes, I've read it twice because I read it back to back. That's how much I loved it. It was just so much fun. So this book, it has great characters, and it has an interesting plot, and it has, even when you know the reveals your second time around, like I kind of like with Big Little Lies, you can pick up on some of the subtleties that you may have missed the first time, but it also is just so much fun. And it's just, it's such an entertaining thrill ride. Maybe thrill ride. I mean, yeah, sure, it's thrilling, but yeah, very exciting. And yeah, I loved it the first time and the second time. I would highly recommend. You should also go see the movie in theaters, and then after you see the movie, well, you should read the book. Anyway, check out my Bookverse movie for it though. The first 5 minutes are spoiler free. And then we have Frankenstein by Mary Shelley. This book I have read 3 times, and I will be reading it again next month because I'm doing a Bookverse movie for it. I will be comparing it with the Robert De Niro adaptation, so very excited. I've seen that movie before, but it's been a while. But anyway, so I've read this book 3 times. I read it in like 2010 or 11, and then I read it again in 2019, and then I read it again in 2020, so I read it back-to-back years. Anyway, this is one where we have great characters, great writing, and there is so much to think about, and so many different layers, and so many different symbolism and themes going on in this book, so I'm very excited to read it yet again. And it's a story a lot of people know about, but if you haven't given it a shot and read it, you definitely should, because I almost guarantee it's going to give you more than what you expect. And it's a great character analysis, and also just like a human analysis and what it means to be human, right? And what it means to create things and be a creator. So like I said, really excited to get into this yet again. And yeah, I've read this one 3 times now, and I've really enjoyed it. And then another book you will not be surprised to hear me list, and that is Misery by Stephen King. There are a number of Stephen King books I want to read again. However, this is the only one I've read twice. So when I do a video like this again a year from now, I'm sure there will be a few other Stephen King books in there. But for now, Misery is the only one I've read twice, and I absolutely loved it so much. Just as good the second time. Highly recommend. It's a great horror story, but it is also really inspirational and a beautiful story and very motivational, and it made me cry. And it's also symbolism for what it's like to be stuck in addiction, to be held captive by addiction, and to be hobbled by addiction, And the character of Paul is incredible. The character of Annie is great too. She's a great villain. Yeah, so you get great characters in this, as well as just a great story with lots of symbolism. So I know I talk about this one so much, so I'll end it there. But if you haven't read this book yet, after I've talked about it so much, you should go read it. And last but not least is Anne of Green Gables, which again, I've talked about a fair amount this year. This one I read in 2019, and then I read it again this year, and it is just a joy to read this book about Anne. A lot of people compare Anne of Green Gables with Little Woman, which when I read Little Woman, I was reminded of Anne of Green Gables. But I like Anne of Green Gables far better. Honestly, I don't see myself ever reading Little Woman again. But Anne of Green Gables, yeah, I would love to read that yet a third time, you know? I just love the world of Avonlea, and, you know, like, yeah, there's like different lessons that are learned, but it's not said in like a super cheesy way. It's just very believable and very earnest, but not like in an annoying way, if that makes sense. Yeah, I just really loved it, and you should check out my video where I do a book versus movie, but it's kind of me just talking about why I love it, mixed in with like changes from book to movie. So check that one out if you want to hear me talk more about Anne of Green Gables. And that wraps it up. This video was pretty short. Maybe at some point I'll like do a follow-up video sooner rather than later, since this one just isn't the best setting, but I wanted to film it anyway, even though I'm out of town. So let me know down in the comments if you have read any of these books. Let me know also down in the comments, what is a book that you have read multiple times and you still enjoy even when you've already read it before. So thank you for watching. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe if you are not subscribed. And yeah, I will see you next time. Thank you.